This is Roll Call for this edition of African Drums. The African drums are sounding.
Good evening. Welcome to African Drums, the television organ of the Coffee 250 Committee, an organization dedicated to the empowerment of the African Guyanese community through education and the encouragement of self-activity. I am Elsie Harry, and I'll be your host for this evening's program. June 13th, 2015 marked 35 years since the assassination of renowned Guyanese scholar and revolutionary Dr. Walter Rodney. The name Walter Rodney has remained on the Guyanese landscape all these years, yet the average Guyanese, especially those 40 years and younger, do not know who Walter Rodney really was. His involvement in Guyanese party politics has meant that he is generally seen through the party lens. His contributions are analyzed differently depending on whether one is PPP, PNC, or WPA. Yet, Rodney was perhaps the most important Guyanese gift to the world in the latter half of the 20th century. Brilliant scholar, Black Power activist, and theoretician, Pan-Africanist, apostle of multiracial politics in Guyana, African historian and revolutionary fighter on behalf of the working class, Walter Rodney's reputation goes beyond Guyana. Today, African Drums pays tribute to this son of Guyana who was cut down at age 38. Who really was Dr. Walter Rodney? What were his contributions to Guyana, the Caribbean, and the world? Why does his name generate complex emotions in Guyana? These and other questions I will put to our panel as we present to you Dr. Walter Rodney, the man, the idea, and the message. Our panel today are newspaper columnist, political activist, and academic Freddie Kissoon, Mr. Nigel Hughes, lawyer, political activist, and chairman of the Alliance for Change, and Dr. David Hinds, academic, political activist, and executive member of Rodney's political party, the Working People's Alliance. Gentlemen, welcome to African Drums.
Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Hinds, I will begin with you. Give the audience a profile of Rodney's intervention in politics in Guyana, the Caribbean, and Africa.
Thank you, Elsie, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. As someone who was a young man, along with Freddie Kissoon here, we were part of what you may call the Rodney Young Brigade. As teenagers, we became part of the movement and so had a personal relationship with Walter, working with him. And it's interesting that you frame the question that way, a profile of Walter Rodney's intervention, because Rodney's intervention occurred in the wider Caribbean, in Guyana, and in Africa. He also did work in the United States. He was a constant contributor to a group they call the Institute of the Black World, but principally in Jamaica, Guyana, and Tanzania, Africa, where he was located. Rodney was really an ordinary working class boy, growing up in Ben Street. His father was a tailor, his mother was a homemaker. So he's what we call a poor boy, and came from South Georgetown, the poorest section of the town. And he won an open scholarship to the University of Guyana, not the university, Queen's College. And that's important because at that time, poor people did not get a chance to go to Queen's College. And it was as a result of the 1953 government, the first government that we had as a result of adult suffrage, led by the then United PPP, that made it possible for poor people children to go on to Queen's College. And Rodney won this open scholarship, went there and apparently did, well, not apparently, did brilliantly in terms of his studies and so on. And then won a scholarship to go to the University of the West Indies, Mona, in Jamaica, where he studied history. In particular, studying African history. And there's this story that he tells that after he got to Jamaica in 1960, one of the professors gave them this essay to do, to talk about history of England and the history of Africa. And he found that he, along with the others, could talk very eloquently about the history of England, having been part of the colony and so forth, but didn't know as much about African history. And he took the decision there and then that he was going to study African history. All right? Studied history, graduated, and then went on to the School of African and Oriental Studies in England, where he did his PhD in African history, and graduating in 1966 at the age of 24. Right now, that's quite interesting. I mean, because it shows that someone who was on a mission. And I remember Rodney would tell us later on, look, go to university, hustle and finish that thing, and be ready to do the work after then. Graduating at age 24 in 1966, went to Tanzania for a short stint where he taught there, and then came back to University of the West Indies in Mona to teach in 1968. Now, when he got to the university in 1968, the University of when he got back now as a professor, he found that there was no course in African history being taught at the university, and he sought to get such a course. They didn't allow him. So what he did was he took to the streets, and he went out into the streets in the poor areas of Kingston, and then he branched out to rural areas and began to talk to people about African history at the street corners. And he apparently started with 10 people, and then somebody would hear, well, this university lecturer is coming to talk about African history, and then next week will be 20 and 30, and he started to go around the poor areas in Jamaica talking about African history. This became apparently an institution that Rodney himself would describe in a book of essays later on as the groundings with my brothers. No, this is 1968, we're now becoming independent. Jamaica and Trinidad in 1962, Barbados and Guyana in 1966. Yet, in a country, Jamaica, which is 90-something% black, in a region that is predominantly black, no African history. All right. Now, Rodney's teaching African history, and he would object to me saying teaching, because he did say, as he went out into the countryside talking about African history, he found that the people in the countryside, particularly the Rastafarians, knew more about African history than he did at a certain level, because they had been in touch with Africa intellectually and culturally and otherwise. So it was quite an experience of grounding. Now, this apparently sent shivers down the spine of the government of the day. It was a Jamaica Labour Party government led then by Hugh Shearer. And they found, in the context of what was happening in the world and the Caribbean, that here is this young black man going out and talking to black people about black history. They found this quite destabilizing. And so Rodney went to a conference in Montreal, Canada, a black writers conference, and when he came back from the conference, he was barred from re-entering Jamaica. He's not a Jamaican, he's Guyanese, of course, and at that time we didn't have CARICOM and all of that stuff. We were still colonies. Well, not colonies, we were independent by then, but we didn't have CARICOM and all that thing. So he's banned from Jamaica. Word then got around to the students that here is this lecturer who's been banned. By then, Rodney had become quite a very popular lecturer on campus. And so the students, led by Rav Gonzalez, who is now the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who was the head of the student guild at the time. Patrick Manning was there on campus at the same time. Now, they decided that they were going to march to the Prime Minister's office to protest the banning of this young lecturer, right? And so they set out the next morning, marching to the Prime Minister's office. Now, they got to a juncture, and then they saw a large crowd coming in the opposite direction. Now, they didn't know what it was. It would turn out in a few minutes that it was a crowd of young people, young men and women from the poor areas in Jamaica, the Rastafarians, staging their own march to protest against Rodney banning. So here you had the coming together of the working class and the students and academics from the University of Guyana marching to go to the thing. So this soon became known as the Rodney March, which would later become the Rodney, quote-unquote, Rodney riots. You know, we in the Caribbean, anything protest, we call it a riot. Nevertheless, they were confronted by the police, and the people retaliated, and buildings were burned, and so forth, and it became known as the Rodney riots. What that incident did was to spark the beginning of the Black Power movement in the Caribbean. The Black Power movement had just started a year ago in the United States, led by Stokely Carmichael and others. Stokely Carmichael was from Trinidad. We had the launch, as a result of the Rodney, the so-called Rodney riots, the launch of the Black Power movement. Because soon, a lot of those students left and went back to their respective islands and formed Black Power organizations. Rodney, having been banned from Jamaica, spent a couple of months in Cuba, and then went back to Tanzania, where he took up a lectureship in African history. Now, he spent 5 years in Tanzania from 1969 to 1974. And in those 5 years in Tanzania, he did a couple of very important things. One, he wrote a book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which has now become a sort of a Bible in African historiography. In a sense, what that book did was to change the way in which academics approach an explanation of underdevelopment in Africa, and I would say the rest of the developing world, or what we call the third world. Later on, Manning Marble in the United States would talk about how African Americans were underdeveloped by capitalism. Basically, what Rodney did was to draw the relationship between development and underdevelopment. And his argument was that some countries are developed precisely because other countries are underdeveloped. And that would really open up a whole new school, what they call the dependency school in academia. But it became easily, and still is, the most important book about African history. While in Africa, Rodney also played important roles in working among working people, and very importantly, among the freedom fighters in Africa. Now, 69 to 74, the anti-apartheid movement is raging, right? The anti-colonial movement had not come to an end because Portugal was holding on to its colonies in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and so there was that struggle still going on there. And Rodney would go among these freedom fighters and talk to them about African history and teach them and so. And Zimbabwe, Ian Smith was still there. And Namibia was still raging. So it was the freedom struggle was still raging in Africa, and Rodney developed this relationship with some of these freedom fighters, some of them who are in office now, as in Uganda and so on, who interfaced with him. And so those were really pivotal years for Rodney. But he has always felt, I understand, that while he contributed to Africa, that Africa, in the final analysis, was not quote unquote his land of birth, and that he needed to contribute directly to his own country. And so he came back to Guyana. I understand that Professor Clive Thomas, who was a close colleague, had something to do in influencing him to come back to Guyana. And so he came back to Guyana in 1974, having applied to be the chair of the history department at the University of Guyana, got the job, came back and was ready for the job, and when he got here, found out that the job was no longer his, that he was being denied the job, largely because the government of the day, like the government of Jamaica, felt that such a person like Walter Rodney would be a threat to the country. I think the calculation may have been that Rodney would have left and gone back because he had offers all over the world at prestigious universities, but he chose to stay in Guyana, and he joined, and I'm stressing joined, the Working People's Alliance. Some people call him the founder of the WPA. He was not the founder of the WPA. The WPA had come together before Rodney arrived. It came together. It was the Ratoon group led by Clive Thomas and Josh Ramsamy and others at the University of Guyana, made up of students and professors. There was a segment of a group called the Movement Against Oppression, which was also part of that movement. It was ASCRIA, led by Elsie, the Afrocentric group, and then IPRA, led by Moses Bago and the Indian People's Revolutionary Associate, and the Working People's Vanguard Party, led by Brindley Ben. Those were the groups that came together and formed the early WPA in early 1974. Rodney comes back, and he joins the WPA. So just a note for those historians who make that mistake over and again, and even the people in the media, he was a founder member of the WPA. No, he was not a founder. This is not a takeaway from him. It's just really to correct history. All right? Now, when Rodney was denied the job, ASCRIA mounted a series of meetings across the country to protest Rodney's expulsion, not expulsion, denial of the right to work at the university. And they invited all the political organizations to join that movement. And they had massive meetings in Georgetown. It was described by Quine in one of his pieces that it was the largest meetings to date that they had seen since 1953. It had been the first time that Chedi Jagan and Elsie Quine, who were both founder members of the early PPP, it was the first time they were seen on the same platform for almost 18 years. So here was Rodney bringing the organizations together. Of course, a lot of those meetings were broken up and so on and so forth. The fact is that Rodney stayed, joined the WPA, and became the foremost leader in the organization. And for the next 6 years, from 74 to 78 to 1980, when he was assassinated, he worked with the WPA towards building a kind of multiracial movement in Guyana. The movement was directed principally at the government in power, which had become increasingly authoritarian, and Rodney felt as a matter of principle, as a matter of course, that he needed to participate in that struggle, and so therefore helped to galvanize public response against that. And the WPA in that period, again, this is for the historians, became perhaps the most powerful party in Guyana, in the sense that it was drawing people across ethnic lines, across class lines, bringing together the middle classes, the working class, East Indians, Africans, and so forth. And moved to the point in 1980 where many felt that the WPA could have taken the reins of government in this country. Rodney was assassinated in 1980, and of course, as they say, the rest is history.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Hinds.
You're welcome.
That is Walter Rodney's legacy in a nutshell. So we'll include Nigel Hughes now in the discussion. Dr. Hinds brought us throughout Rodney's life right up to Guyana. Why does Walter Rodney's name generate the kind of emotions in Guyanese people?
Thanks for having me here. Actually, Freddie is far more familiar. I was a student in St. Stanislaus College when Walter was at his peak. My father used to take us to meetings where the police would break up the meetings. Actually, there was a very famous meeting where he had to scale a couple of fences in Campbellville. And Walter Rodney at that time, I think, epitomized the spirit of resistance. He epitomized the fact that you could fight authoritarianism. And particularly because he was an African Guyanese, fighting an African Guyanese government, authoritarian as it was. This was the first time you had a real, serious political challenge to the existing regime. A lot of people don't remember this, but by the time Walter was around, we were in around 1977, the state had the police, they had the GDF, they had the People's Militia, they had the National Service, and there was a significant degree of militarization of the state. And it was in that environment that Walter really appealed to me as an individual and several people in our class, because we were fighting what we thought was an oppressive authoritarian regime. And there was this single symbol who was brave enough to take on the entire state apparatus. The day he got assassinated, I was writing GCE O-levels, and I literally left the classroom and joined the march. My mother took me home, and we joined the march at what we call the Guards Turn, which is where the Russian embassy is now, and marched all the way down to the burial ground. They had a meeting, and the symbol then was "Don't Mourn, Organize." And part of the excitement of the time was that we actually thought that that march might actually result in a change of government, because we heard that the government was at its weakest, that this would be a people's protest, and that the movement would take over because Rodney had been taken from us. I have to say, as a student at the time, I was deeply disappointed that nothing took place. We went to the march. There were great symbols. They had him on a horse cart. He was taken to the burial ground. But nothing happened after that. And certainly, as a student going into sixth form, we always thought that the Working People's Alliance had the capacity to strike back at the authority, the government of the day, because we wanted to see some sort of leveling of the playing field. But as an intellectual, and I just wanted to add something to what David said, even though Shearer, the JLP, lost power, and the left-wing PNP came into power, which Rodney was actually one of their heroes, because he articulated a different world vision. Even though the PNP came into power in Jamaica, they did not revoke the fact that he had been banned from that region. Coming to Guyana, Rodney appealed across the line, and I think his greatest threat to the regime at that time was that you actually had the intelligentsia and the middle class who were beginning to come out in various groups and organizing against the authoritarian state of affairs. I think for most students of that era, when he died, it had a salutary effect in this sense. It indicated that the state was prepared to go to extreme measures to get rid of a leader who was challenging them. But at the same time, he was a symbol of hope, intellectually, to all people, all races, especially the young people, that if you stand up for what was right, if you stood up for what in effect was a new day, which he articulated. He was the only person who was articulating that, not the People's Progressive Party. At that time, Rodney was at the vanguard. It wasn't just Rodney as well. You had a whole set of people. You had, what Green is his name? I can't remember his name. Omowale, Benita Bone. There were people there, Clive Thomas, who were resisting, and they would come to our house at late hours of the night because they were always on the surveillance. And these people symbolized resistance. Several of their members got shot and killed, guns placed on them, accused of all sorts of crimes. So I think the symbol of Rodneyism really is the intellectual freedom, the fact that he looked at existing information and data, interpreted it in a totally different route that allowed us to really see what actually happened. I think his greatest contribution really was to the world, not just to Guyana, was to the world as an intellectual.
Okay, Mr. Kissoon, can you comment on why the name Walter Rodney generates complex emotions in Guyana?
Okay, let me preface my contribution by saying I have a different emotional feeling in this room now. I've been a couple times as a guest on this program, and I feel I'm liberated. We're having this program at a very, very historic time. And so this is a different feeling coming into this room with Coffee 250. There are four great Guyanese of the 20th century and 3 of them have forever taken a place in the Guyanese psyche. That's Burnham, Jagan, and Critchlow. Of the 4, I think Critchlow, Jagan, and Burnham are just there, as they say in common parlance, in your face. Critchlow statue is Parliament Building. There's a big educational institute in Critchlow Labour College, which will be resuscitated with the new government. I've seen a press release about that. Burnham and Jagan, I think, have legacies that the historian can seriously question how complete are those legacies. But of the 4, I think the one that this country has done injustice to is Walter Rodney, because of the 4, I would think Rodney's contribution to Guyana is more philosophical, and philosophy is the basis of everything. And I would hope after this year that from here on, however it is done, that Rodney's death anniversary would be so observed, celebrated, that it will leave in the consciousness of Guyanese the way Burnham, Jagan, and Critchlow legacies have. Now, the program is titled The Man in His ID. The power I saw in Rodney's praxis is his contribution to the translation of philosophy to post-colonial struggle. Rodney made an important philosophical contribution to the concept of justice in post-colonial society. I like what he said. He said, look, a culture has its own dynamics, it has its own virtue, but justice exists independent of any culture. Justice is a human absolute value. So what he did on the basis of that, and in that sense I think he was nearer to the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau than any other third world political activist, because I think Rousseau was the philosopher most of all who refined what justice is and how it should be distributed in a society. And what Rodney did, and there was a manifestation of that philosophy that will remain with me forever, he said that a culture can have its own contradictions, can have its own caricature version of justice. Therefore, when a culture embarks on injustice, it affects the absolute value of justice. It denies other people justice. So what Rodney set out to do was to show that the post-colonial government that we were so euphoric about because we overthrew the white man, we were now supposed to distribute justice to us. Our leaders were not supposed to live in mansions and ride horses. And so what he said is that the post-colonial government, which is our culture, has its injustices. And therefore, his role was to warn us in post-colonial times that our own people can be as bad as the white man. And the manifestation of that will remain in me forever, and I think that has shaped me, was the Arnold Rampersad trial, in which an East Indian man was charged for shooting to death a policeman at a protest at the quarantine toll station. Rodney felt that the man was just being used in a game of race, that was not the man who did it, but they just wanted to prosecute an East Indian man that was a PPP activist. And Rodney went to the corners of Guyana and told African Guyanese, in particularly the jury in that trial, that when you go to that level of being used by your own culture to suppress another culture, it eventually, you're losing your dignity, but it will come back to haunt you. And I think Rampersad got off because of the single-handed intervention of Walter Rodney. So the point is, his value, more than I would say even C.L.R. James and Frantz Fanon, because they were essentially academics. They were activists. Fanon was involved in the Algerian struggle, not so much C.L.R. James. But why Rodney, for me, is the figure of the 20th century is because he translated that philosophy and gave Guyana a philosophical concept of justice. So it took two forms. The post-colonial government has failed you. Do not look at it in cultural terms. These were men and women that have failed you, even though you and them belong to the same culture. The second thing is the multiracial aspect of justice. You know, I've read a column by Henry Jeffrey that I was so livid, I was so angry that I replied immediately. He said that of the figures of the 20th century, Dr. Jagan was more sincere in this bringing about this multiracial thing. And there and then I went on my keyboard and I wrote a column and I wrote a reply and I said it was Rodney. Because I think from post-colonial times, no one have struggled philosophically and politically to bring about a multiracial society and sacrifice so much as Walter Rodney. So in that sense, I think of the four men, there's a vacuum there. The vacuum of us not celebrating Rodney sufficient, but the idea, as the program say, the man, the idea, and the message. And the idea is, be careful of your own. Justice does not exist in culture. Justice exists by itself as a philosophical value. And what is so important is that we are on the threshold of something very great. We are about a month of a multiracial coalition in government, 35 years after Walter's death. And we should keep Walter's warning and his sacrifice that amidst this euphoria that your own has come in to power, make sure that your own treats you as your own.
Okay, thank you. Do you have something to add, Dr. Hinds?
Yes, I mean, your question I find interesting about the complexity, why the complex emotion. Guyana and the Caribbean are very complex societies, right? I think it was C.L.R. James who referred to them as as being the center of modernization because of the complexity. Very small societies, but these were the whole notion of globalization, for example, really was born in these islands and mainland states. The slavery was African labor, Amerindians, Native American lands, European seeking to expand their wealth and so forth. And what we today call globalization is really latest in that phase. And so these are very complex societies, different cultures operating in these small spaces. All right, and so therefore I think Rodney represents that complexity. In that he grappled, as Freddie and Nigel hinted, grappled with this phenomenon of race and class. I know of no political activist or philosopher who has managed to really solve that contradiction of race and class. But I think Walter Rodney came the closest to really teasing out that complexity of race and class. Why is it an ordinary working class East Indian who would have been abused by the government for the last 23 years would go back and vote for that government? Or African, Freddie was talking about justice and so on. And Rodney, it teased out that, not just academically, but teased it out on the streets in Guyana, all right? In conversations with people. No, African Guyanese, for example, part of our heritage is to hold on to the performer, the bright man, the academic. It's part of that thing, and it has to be that response that comes out of the slave plantation, the Joshuas and so on and so forth. They hold on to that, and there is that in the African Guyanese response to Rodney. Here is a bright man. Here is a man that is intellectual and so on and so forth. Here's a man that really came to this country and pushed this country in a certain direction. But we are also attached to our political parties. All right. So here is Burnham, the hero. All right, heading this government in this multi-ethnic society. So Rodney, the philosopher, scholar, hero, all right, challenging the political big man, the political hero, right, leads to really fantastic contradictions. And so I think part of the response of the ordinary people is that, where, as they told us, the people in the West Coast Bobis, the black villages, told Dr. Rodney and Dr. Rupnarayan and myself when we were there campaigning in 2011, and the APNU was just formed, bringing together the WPA and the PNC. And they say they wanted to thank us for freeing them from having to make the choice between Burnham people and Guyana and Rodney people, and we realize then what that means. And so you have this kind of complex response on the part of African Guyanese. Brilliant man, he's ours, but man, he challenged the black government and so forth. On the part of East Indians, we have the same kind of complex response, because Rodney also challenged not just the PNC of the day, but challenged the PPP of the day, the kind of vanguardist authoritarian instinct in these parties. The PPP was not in government. They would later come to government, and they would later take the authoritarian state to a higher level than the PNC ever dreamed of taking it. And so they themselves have that kind of response to Rodney. Here is this man who is preaching and practicing the politics of liberation. But of course, if you're going to challenge the PPP, then there's that kind of split response. So I think the emotions, the complex emotions that Rodney evokes, speaks to the complexity of our society, but it also speaks to some of the questions which we still have to work out as post-plantation people. We're early, we're still early, 50 years into independence. It's still not enough time to work out some of those tensions that still exist in our society. But I think once, as we progress with working out those tensions, I think we will come closer to appreciating Walter Rodney in the same way that Trinidad is moving closer to appreciating a C.L.R. James, or the Black America is moving towards recognizing a Malcolm X.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Hinds.
I have a question for both Freddie and David. If there were free and fair elections when Rodney was alive, where would the black masses have cast their vote? I'm not asking you if the PPP would have won, because it is clear the black vote would have been split and the PPP would have won, or even without that, the PPP numerically and the traditional support. But in terms of casting their vote, where do you think the African person, whether urban, rural, or wherever situated, would have cast their vote? And I ask both of them because I'm very sympathetic to Freddie's analysis on the fact. The only thing I wanted to add to that is that Rodney was the only intellectual I knew in the Caribbean history that took his theory into practice. Some would argue, like C.L.R. James did, you don't play with revolution, but he was prepared to do it, and for that we recognize it. But I do want to ask that question.
I would say, given the phenomenal rise of his presence, but most of all, his scholarship was formidable, and his scholarship went right into the heart of African communities, Guyanese communities. Why I think Walter died is because Walter discredited and exposed the immediate post-colonial government. And Walter's job was made easier because all over the world, Algeria, etc., post-colonial governments were becoming dictatorships. And I think because of that vivid, trenchant exposure, and in the process, showing people where your post-colonial government had failed, he had replaced Burnham as the hope for people, and therefore they would have gone with him. He had all the qualities to have supplanted Burnham, but most of all, he didn't have the baggage. He didn't rule people. He didn't show up tear gas in bauxite workers' cell when they were locked up in Linden in 1970. So by that time, if there was a free and fair election in Burnham, or any other African leader from the PNC was competing with Rodney, it would have been a village cricketer versus Brian Lara. I think they would have voted for him. There's no question about him. You have to be around him to feel the magnifying presence and the scholarship of the man. It's something that people cannot describe. You have to be it. I was telling a group of people in the AFC last night that you have to be in the courtroom to see the magnetism of Nigel Hughes. You can't be. You have to experience it, and you have to be there to experience Walter. So to answer the question, I think in African Guyanese would have voted for it.
Dr. Hinds, your response?
I have to agree with Freddie, and one can never know with these things. You can never know. But if an election was held in 1979, the latter months in Walter Rodney's life, I think African Guyanese would have voted for Walter Rodney.
You indulge me one last question to them?
Yeah.
Maybe. Just a minute though. We're almost out of time, so you can ask the question, but 1 minute each for your response to Nigel's question.
What, with 2020 vision, what should the WP have done after his assassination to have changed the course of history so we didn't have to wait for 92?
Well, what could the WPA have done? I don't think it's any secret that there were forces in and close to the WPA who felt that there should have been retaliation. And as in those situations, you would always have division on what the course of action should have been. I think in the context of the Cold War, Reagan had just come to power and had signaled where he stood in terms of revolutionary action. We had Grenada, which was undergoing tremendous pressure at the time. I think in the end, the option that the WPA took of organizing in a gradual way turned out to be the better option. I think I myself, as a young 19-year-old at the time, felt that we should have retaliated. I mean, that was my firm view. But I think history has taught us that it was perhaps not a wise option to have taken.
Okay.
WPA didn't have the mass base embeddedment in the Guyanese society to have taken those numbers to confront a dictatorship. And secondly, when you kill someone of that international stature, optimism goes right down, and it's difficult to people just become faithful.
Okay.
So you gotta rest. You
Okay.
gotta rest.
Mr. Hughes, you are the chairman of AFC, so I'll ask you this question. The previous government launched a commission of inquiry into the assassination of Walter Rodney. This present government does not seem enthusiastic about continuing that commission of inquiry. Can you comment on that?
Sure. I think the commission of inquiry that was set up was disrespectful to Rodney because it wasn't a genuine attempt to find out what really happened to Walter. So it got placed in a political context coming up to a national election. And I think that did the worst damage, and it's the worst sign of disrespect to Walter Rodney. To continue what had what I would call a bad birth really doesn't help. I think we need we do need a commission of inquiry into Rodney's death. I think the terms of reference need to be agreed by all the potential stakeholders so that we do at the end of the day close that chapter. I don't think the present structure can do it. It's too flawed. But we spent a lot of money on it, and I'm not sure that given that it came in a political context with political terms of reference, that the result of this commission, given its terms of reference, is going to be useful to the history either of Rodney or helpful to the people of Guyana.
Okay, final question, 1 minute each, and I'll be timing you guys. What is Walter Rodney's lasting legacy to Guyana and the rest of the world? Freddie, you can begin.
That the best society is one in which different cultures that coexist need to recognize each other, and they need each other. and that justice, liberty, and freedom is best guaranteed in a multiracial society by that society coming together and recognizing the value of each other.
That there is no disjoint between theory and practice, between the academic and the intellectual and activism. In the final analysis, one achieves nothing without resistance. What he did was to awake a spirit of resistance in this country, which has finally paid dividend on May 11th, because although those elections were about scratching an X on a ballot, those X's that were put there for the coalition were resistance X's. And as you put those X, I can see Walter Rodney's vision, his message looming very large there. Resistance is the way to progress.
Okay, Nigel.
His greatest legacy is for Guyana?
And the rest of the world.
Oh, it's got to be his intellectual, analytical skills.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for being on African Drums. Thank you, viewers, for staying with us as we spoke about Dr. Walter Rodney, the man, the idea, and the message. This has been African Drums, the television organ of the Coffee 250 Committee, an organization dedicated to the empowerment of the African Guyanese community through education and the encouragement of self-activity. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Coffee 250, and send us an email, coffee250gy@gmail.com. Please donate to the cause and send us your questions or comments. Thank you. Please join us next time.
Hey, I miss Norway body. You went to Norway body?
Yeah.
You went to Norway body.
I challenge you on that.